Brooklyn, New York, autumn 1965. The air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts and wet concrete as Margaret Maggie Donovan stepped into an old thrift shop tucked between a deli and a boarded-up cinema on Flatbush Avenue. She was 42 now, quiet, private, a librarian at the Brooklyn Public Library who walked the same route home every evening, always with a book under her arm, always alone. 20 years earlier, she'd been engaged to Captain James Whittaker, an Army Air Forces pilot stationed in England during World War II. They met during a USO dance in 1943. He in uniform, she in a red dress borrowed from her sister. He had this calm steadiness about him, the kind that made you believe the world might actually survive. They wrote letters almost daily. He promised her a wedding under an oak tree in Prospect Park the moment he returned, but James never came home. His plane went down during a bombing run over France in June 1944, listed as MIA, missing in action. No remains, no definitive answers. Only a telegram and a box of personal items, letters, a photo taken the week before he shipped out, and the ring he never had the chance to give her. Maggie didn't marry. She built a quiet life, books, coffee, her little apartment filled with plants and old music. But somewhere in the back of her closet, in a small wooden box wrapped in silk, she kept everything that once tied her to James. She never stopped thinking of him. Not really. That afternoon, the thrift store was dimly lit and musty, filled with the scent of mothballs and furniture polish. Maggie wandered past shelves of forgotten china and cracked picture frames until a small velvet box caught her eye. It was tucked beneath a stack of vintage military caps, navy blue with gold trim. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a Bronze Star medal engraved on the back, Captain James Whittaker. Her knees nearly buckled. How did his medal end up here, decades later, on a dusty shelf in Brooklyn? The shop owner, a soft-spoken man with thick glasses, said it came in a bulk donation from an estate clean-out. Some veterans' care facility upstate had closed. He had no idea who it belonged to or how it got there. Maggie bought it on the spot, walked home in silence, the medal heavy in her coat pocket. That night she placed it beside James's old photograph, the one where he stood beside a plane, squinting into the sun with that same steady expression. He had asked once in his final letter, "If I don't come back, find me in the things I leave behind." And now, perhaps she had. If this story touches your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Maggie Donovan sat at her kitchen table well past midnight, the medal laid gently on a dish towel beside a steaming mug of tea she'd reheated twice. The medal felt cold at first, heavier than she remembered Bronze Stars to be, though she had only seen one once, briefly, in her father's hand after he returned from the Pacific, but this one was James's. That was certain. His name was etched on the back in neat, formal script, Captain James Whittaker. Not just a coincidence, not a replica, not a dream. She barely slept that night. Her mind was a carousel of questions, spinning faster with every loop. How had James's medal ended up in a thrift shop in Brooklyn? Where had it been all these years? Had it ever made it back to his family, or had someone else kept it? She thought of his mother, stern and quiet, who lived in a brownstone in Park Slope. She died in the late 50s, alone, as far as Maggie knew. No siblings, no wife. James had only her. By dawn, Maggie had made up her mind. She started with the thrift shop owner. He remembered little, only that the medal came in one of several boxes donated by a company that handled belongings from an old veterans care facility in Dutchess County that had shut down 2 months prior. He scribbled down the name, Hudson Pines Veterans Home. Maggie folded the paper and tucked it into her purse like a ticket. That Monday, she called the number listed for the company. A receptionist answered, indifferent but polite. Yes, the facility had closed. No, there were no individual records accessible. Everything not claimed had been donated or discarded. Maggie asked if any documentation might show a list of residents, even initials, even old admission forms. The woman promised to pass her request to a supervisor. Maggie hung up, unsure if she'd hear back. Still, she couldn't let it go. She spent her lunch breaks at the public library's local archives. She scrolled through microfilm newspapers, scanned veteran obituaries, searched property records for the facility. The building had stood for nearly 60 years, housing hundreds of men over the decades. There were no records online, no digital footprints. It was as if time had swallowed the place whole. That weekend, she took the train upstate. Hudson Pines sat at the edge of a faded county road, surrounded by pine trees that looked tired and overgrown. The front gate was padlocked, but a side path led through to the back of the property. The windows were boarded up, paint peeled from the siding. Maggie didn't need to go inside. Just standing there, with the wind rustling the dry needles at her feet, she felt the ache of all the stories left behind. She took a photograph and went home. Back in Brooklyn, she dug out the letters James had sent her, 24 in total, all kept in a small blue shoebox marked England, 1943-44. She hadn't opened it in years. The ink had faded, but the words still carried him. "You know, Maggie, if anything happens, I hope something of me makes its way back to you. A thought, a photograph, a part of my voice. Something. You'll know it when you see it." That line shook her, because the medal, maybe it was that something. She spent the next 2 weeks writing letters to the State Department of Veterans Affairs, to local historical societies, to anyone who might have access to old patient logs or staff rosters from Hudson Pines. Most responses were kind, but fruitless. Others simply said no. But one envelope, returned in a cream-colored sleeve, caught her breath. It was from a retired social worker named Ellen March, who had volunteered at Hudson Pines during the 60s. Her letter was handwritten, formal but tender. She remembered a man, quiet, maybe in his 40s then, who arrived at the facility with no next of kin and limited medical documentation. He had no photographs, but sometimes hummed songs from the 1940s and spoke in clipped Midwestern tones. He responded to the name James, sometimes Jim. He suffered from memory loss, especially long-term recall, but she wrote something that sent shivers down Maggie's spine. He used to sit on the bench near the West Courtyard and say one name, often in whispers, Maggie. Maggie pressed her hand to her mouth and wept. For 2 decades, while she built a quiet life in the city, James might have been alive just a few hours north, adrift in fog, holding her name like a lifeline. The boy who kissed her under a street lamp in 1944, who called her his anchor, might have survived the crash, might have returned, just not fully. Maggie wasn't angry. There was no room for that now, only awe and a determination to know more. That night, she laid out the medal, the letters, the photograph, and a yellowing newspaper clipping from 1944 that listed James among the missing. One line, circled in pencil long ago, read, "Presumed lost." Maggie underlined the word presumed, because now everything had changed. The discovery of Ellen March's letter gave Maggie something she hadn't allowed herself in decades: momentum. Not hope, not quite, but movement. The idea that James had survived, even partially, even silently, turned every moment she had grieved into something unfinished. Her mornings became sharper, more intentional. She began each day by holding the medal for a few seconds, as if it were a compass drawing her forward. She called Ellen the following Monday. The woman's voice was soft but clear, lined with the warmth of memory. "I was young when I met him," Ellen said. "But you don't forget someone who holds on like that. He used to stare at the trees in the courtyard like he was waiting for something to come through them." They spoke for nearly an hour. Ellen confirmed what Maggie feared and needed. The man she remembered had been admitted in 1961 under the initials JW. No confirmed identity, minimal speech, but deeply calm. There was something about him, Ellen said, like he knew more than he could say. Ellen offered Maggie the name of another nurse who had worked at the facility during those years, Clara Dubois. Clara had retired in Albany and, by a stroke of good fortune, still kept old notes from her nursing days, sketches, names, impressions. Maggie wrote to her immediately. While she waited, she returned to the Brooklyn Public Library and requested access to military archives through their special collections desk. The librarian, Mr. Cho, had served in Korea and recognized Maggie from her daily visits. He was the kind of man who didn't need an explanation. He simply nodded and pointed her toward the microfiche reels. Over several afternoons, Maggie unearthed a document that startled her. A military report dated August 12, 1944, listed the crash site of James's B-24 bomber in northern France. 4 crew members were confirmed killed, 2 had been captured, 1 was unaccounted for, presumed dead but never confirmed. That name, Captain James Whittaker. This was the first official suggestion that James may have survived the crash. She sent copies of the document to the Department of Defense's POW-MIA office, along with a formal inquiry. In return, they acknowledged that several American servicemen captured in France had been moved through German POW routes and transferred east toward what is now Poland. Some remained in limbo after liberation, lacking ID, language, or mental clarity. The chaos of post-war Europe meant some fell through the cracks. Could James have been one of them? Maggie thought of the James Ellen described. The silence, the humming, the name whispered on a bench. Could trauma have locked his mind in place? Could he have been rescued, repatriated, and placed quietly into a care system that lost track of his identity? A week later, Clara Dubois responded. Her letter was longer, written on floral stationery in tidy script. She remembered Mr. Whittaker vividly, tall, distant, but oddly gentle. He never made trouble, she wrote. He had a way of sitting still for hours, like he was listening to someone only he could hear. She included a photocopy of a page from her old nurse's journal. At the top was the date, April 14th, 1962. Underneath, a single sentence. Patient whispered name again today, Maggie, cried softly after. Maggie had to set the letter down. She sat in her living room with the curtains drawn, the air still. Her tea had gone cold, untouched. She looked around at the quiet room she'd lived in for years and realized it had always been waiting for him too. The next day, she contacted the administration office of Hudson Pines again, this time asking for records of transfers prior to the facility's closure. A young man named Jacob offered to help. There's not much, he warned. Most of it was shredded during the closure, but I can see if any staff logs remain. 3 days later, Jacob called back. I found something, he said. There's a discharge record dated March 10th, 1963. It lists a James W., no last name, transferred to a long-term veterans facility in Queens, a place called Hillside Haven. Maggie didn't know whether to cry or scream. Hillside Haven still existed. She called immediately. The woman on the phone checked the old logbooks and after a moment asked Maggie to hold. When she returned, her voice was quieter. There was a James W. here, she said. He passed away in 1971. No family ever claimed the body. He's buried in the veterans section of Greenwood Cemetery. Maggie hung up and sat in silence. James had been here, in the same city. She had walked within miles of him for years. He had died alone, but not forgotten. The next morning, she dressed in her Sunday best and made her way to Greenwood. The veterans section was quiet, solemn. The graves were marked with simple stones, some bearing only initials and service branch. After an hour, she found it. JW U.S. Army Air Forces, 1919-1971. No epitaph, no mention of love or loss, just initials and silence. Maggie stood there, medal in hand, the same sky above them both as in 1944. She knelt, whispered his name, and placed a single rose at the foot of the stone. He had come home. somehow in pieces, but now he was found. Maggie returned from Greenwood Cemetery with a strange kind of stillness in her bones. Not peace, not closure, but something akin to a deep breath held for years, finally released. James had been there, not in a dream, not in memory, but in her own city. She'd passed him in time, if not in space. The idea clung to her that love could survive war, confusion, even decades of silence. He had remembered her name. That was the miracle. But the story didn't end there. She contacted Hillside Haven again and requested to speak with anyone who might have worked during James's time there. Most of the staff had long since moved on or passed away, but one name surfaced: Samuel "Sam" Leland, a former orderly who had retired to Long Island. Maggie wrote him a letter explaining her search, the medal, the grave. She enclosed a photo of James in uniform, young, smiling, sleeves rolled up. She didn't expect much. But 2 weeks later, a reply came. It was brief, typed on yellowed paper. "Yes, I remember him. Quiet guy. Everyone called him Captain. Always sat near the east window, liked the light. Sometimes he talked in his sleep. Always the same name, Maggie." Maggie reread the letter over and over. She hadn't imagined it. James had been trying to come back to her in the only ways he could, through whispers, through silence, through fragments of himself that refused to fade. She decided then that James's story needed to be told, not just for her, but for all the others lost in the margins of history. Too many had disappeared into institutions, into forgotten wards, into graves with initials. She owed it to him, and to herself, to make his name whole again. She began by gathering everything: the letters, the medal, the service records, the journal entries from the nurses, the photos, even the thrift shop receipt. She placed them all on her dining room table, turning the space into a kind of war room for memory. Then she reached out to the local Veterans Affairs office in Manhattan, requesting assistance in filing a petition to formally update James Whittaker's military status from missing in action to deceased recovered. The process was long, bureaucratic, and at times disheartening. Forms, proof, interviews, more forms. But slowly, something moved. A case number was assigned, a representative called to verify her connection. The medal helped, so did the gravesite. Eventually she received a formal acknowledgement. James's record would be amended. His service, his death, and his name would be made whole again. The cemetery offered to replace the old headstone. The day the new marker was installed, Maggie returned alone. The sun was soft on her shoulders, the wind quiet. The new stone read, Captain James Whittaker, United States Army Air Forces, 1919-1971. Beloved fiancé, never forgotten. She stood there a long time, but Maggie didn't stop there. She contacted a local veterans writer group in Brooklyn, the Forgotten Voices Project, and offered to share James's story. They welcomed her with open arms. Every week she met with other women and men who had lost someone, not to death necessarily, but to the fog of war, of trauma, of broken systems. There, in a circle of folding chairs and styrofoam cups of coffee, she read from James's letters, from her own journal, from the report that had once simply said, presumed lost. People cried, people nodded. One man, a Vietnam veteran, held her hand and said, "He found you, he did." With encouragement from the group, Maggie began writing. Not a novel, but a memoir. She called it What Remains. Letters for the Man Who Never Left Me. It wasn't just about James, but about waiting, about memory, about how love sometimes survives, even when the people do not. Publishing wasn't the goal, but when a small press in upstate New York heard her read at a community event, they offered to help. The book was released quietly in 1969 with a soft grey cover and James's handwriting embossed in gold. It sold modestly, but found its way into libraries, classrooms, and the hands of people who needed it. In the months that followed, Maggie received letters from war widows, from nurses, from children of MIA soldiers. They thanked her. Some sent medals of their own, photos, worn dog tags, as if passing their memories into her care. One woman wrote, "You gave me permission to grieve someone I never really lost, just couldn't find." Maggie kept them all. Her apartment filled with reminders, not of sadness, but of continuity, of how love echoes, sometimes for years, until someone is ready to hear it again. She began volunteering at Hillside Haven, now a modernized facility for elderly veterans. She read to them, wrote letters for them. She brought flowers on birthdays, and sometimes on quiet afternoons, she would sit by the east window, the one James had loved, and close her eyes, letting the light fall gently on her face. One day, a nurse asked her, "Why do you come here so often?" Maggie smiled softly. "Because someone waited for me once, and I want to do the same." In early spring of 1970, the Brooklyn Veterans Memorial Association reached out to Maggie Donovan. One of their members had read What Remains and was moved by her story, not just for what it revealed about Captain James Whittaker, but for what it illuminated about all the forgotten servicemen who had returned without returning. They asked if she would consider helping organize a small public tribute. Nothing grand, just something dignified. Maggie hesitated, but then she thought of James and the bench in the garden and the name Maggie spoken like a prayer in the dark, and she agreed. Plans began for a commemorative ceremony to honor James and other MIAs whose fates had only recently come to light. The event would be hosted at the Brooklyn Navy Yard beneath the open sky on Memorial Day. Maggie worked closely with the organizers, suggesting readings, helping to choose music, and even writing the inscription for a small plaque that would be unveiled. "To those who were missing but never lost, you were always remembered." Odin, as the day approached, Maggie found herself returning to old letters, touching each page like a relic. She reread James's final note again and again. "If I don't come back, find me in the things I leave behind." The words no longer haunted her. They comforted. They had been a map, and she had followed them all the way to him. On the morning of the ceremony, she rose early and dressed in navy, the color he had loved on her. She pinned the bronze star to her chest, just above her heart. At the Navy Yard, rows of folding chairs were set on the lawn. A modest podium stood beside the flagpole, and beside it, a framed portrait of James, the same photo Maggie had kept since 1944. Veterans of all ages came, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes with ribbons on their lapels. A few carried framed photos of their own lost loved ones. Family members came too, sons and daughters of those who had never returned. Some sat in silence, others whispered memories. A brass quartet played softly in the background. "America the Beautiful," taps, and finally, "I'll be seeing you." When Maggie was introduced, she stepped to the podium slowly. The wind played with her hair as she looked out at the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "I once loved a man who didn't make it home from the war, or so I believed for most of my life. But I've come to understand that sometimes love doesn't follow the paths we expect. James found his way back to me, not with footsteps, but through letters, whispers, and the kindness of strangers who remembered things the world forgot." She held up the medal. This was his, lost for years, found in a thrift shop like a secret waiting to be retold. It brought him back to me. And now, I give it to you, all of you, because his story belongs to more than just me now. As she placed the medal into the display case beside the plaque and James's photo, the audience rose in quiet respect. A military honor guard stepped forward to offer a folded flag. Maggie accepted it with both hands. She didn't cry, not then. She felt whole, as if James was standing just behind her, hand on her shoulder, saying what he always said when she doubted herself. "You're stronger than you think, Maggie." In the weeks that followed, the tribute became a small exhibit in the Brooklyn Historical Society. Visitors left notes. Children asked questions. Veterans lingered longer than expected. Maggie volunteered twice a week, telling James's story to anyone who wanted to listen. But more than that, she listened to theirs, each one a thread in the fabric of remembrance. She never remarried, not because she hadn't loved again, she had briefly, but because James had carved a space in her soul that didn't require replacement. Love, she had learned, wasn't always about presence. Sometimes it was about endurance. Years passed, Maggie grew older, her steps slowed, her handwriting softened, but her mind remained sharp. On quiet afternoons, she sat by her window with a cup of coffee and reread letters from strangers who had found pieces of their own lost ones because of James's story. They thanked her, they called her brave. But Maggie knew the truth. She had simply followed a thread that had been waiting to be pulled. One letter in particular stayed beside her bedside. It read, "My brother was MIA in Korea. For years we thought he was gone without a trace. But your book taught me how to search, how to remember. I found him. Thank you for showing me that love is an archive. We just have to open the drawer." Maggie smiled every time she read it. She knew that legacy wasn't about monuments or medals. It was about story. Who tells it? Who hears it? Who carries it forward? And she had told theirs. Years passed, and Maggie Donovan's world grew quieter, but never empty. Her apartment in Brooklyn remained a warm cocoon of memory, filled with letters, framed photographs, pressed flowers, and one shelf entirely dedicated to James, his medal, his folded flag, the original shoebox of their wartime letters. She dusted it weekly, not out of ritual, but reverence. She continued to volunteer at Hillside Haven into her late 70s. She became a fixture there, Miss Maggie, the woman who read to the veterans, who remembered their birthdays, who brought music and books and asked gentle questions about the past. Sometimes, one of them would mention a name from long ago, and Maggie would write it down, just in case someone was still searching. One day, a young social worker asked her why she had never moved away. "You could live anywhere," he said. "Why stay here?" Maggie looked out the window at the same street she had walked since 1943 and smiled. "Because this is where I waited," she said, "and this is where I found him." She never tried to rewrite history. She never pretended she'd had a second chance to love James in the way most people understood. But she had something better, a story that didn't end in silence, a thread that had led her across time and distance back to the truth. He had survived, he had remembered her, and even when the world had forgotten him, she hadn't. Her memoir, What Remains, continued to circulate. Teachers assigned it. Librarians kept it in local history sections. Veterans groups read it aloud at gatherings. Occasionally, Maggie received handwritten letters from high school students asking if James was real. She always wrote back, yes, he was real, he was brave, and he was loved. Eventually, Maggie's health began to fade. She moved into an assisted living facility just a few blocks from where she and James had once danced at a USO social. Her room was modest, but she brought the essentials. A radio that played old jazz records, a blanket crocheted by her sister, and the medal, always the medal. One morning, a nurse found her sitting peacefully in her armchair, a letter resting on her lap, unsigned but clearly written in her handwriting. It read, "James, I kept my promise. I found you in the things you left behind. I carried your memory when you couldn't, and I shared it when the world was ready to hear it. You were never truly gone. You were just waiting to be found." At her memorial, there were no grand speeches, just music, photographs, and the reading of one final letter, the last she had written but never mailed. It ended simply, "What we love becomes part of the world, and I was lucky enough to walk through that world with your name in my heart." Today, a small plaque rests near the east window of Hillside Haven. It reads, "In memory of Maggie Donovan, she waited, she found, she remembered." We publish new stories every day, real tales that move and inspire. Subscribe to the channel and share this story if it touched your heart.